They call him a madman. The Navy calls him a liar. History calls him a myth. His name was Carl Allende, but the world remembers him by the name he signed at the bottom of his frantic, terrified letters: Carlos Allende. In 1955, a package arrived on the desk of a scientist named Morris Jessup. Inside that package was not just a stack of papers. It was a confession. It was a warning written in different colored inks, with sentences that ran off the page, scrawled by a hand that was shaking with adrenaline and fear. Allende claimed he was there. He claimed he was standing on the deck of the merchant ship USS Andrew Forsyth in October of 1943. He claimed he was watching the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard through a pair of high-powered binoculars when the United States Navy decided to break the laws of physics. We have all heard the legends, the story of the USS Eldridge, the ship that was supposed to turn invisible to radar. The experiment that went wrong. Pop culture tells us it was a time travel accident. Movies tell us it was a teleportation error. But they always leave out the visceral, biological horror of what actually happened on that deck. Tonight, we are not reading the sanitized version. We are not reading the official denial from the Office of Naval Research. We are reading the witness testimony. Because Carlos Allende didn't just see a ship disappear into thin air. He saw what happened when it came back. He saw the cost of playing God. He saw men who were no longer men. He saw flesh merged with the steel. He saw sailors frozen in time, trapped in a single second of agony that lasted for eternity. Before we open this file, I need you to understand one thing. This is not just a ghost story. This is a glimpse into a reality that is sitting right next to ours, separated only by a thin veil of electromagnetic stability. And once you tear that veil, you can never truly sew it back together. My name is Captain Nightwhisper. Turn off the lights, check your surroundings, make sure the walls of your room feel solid. Because where we are going tonight, solid matter is just a suggestion. Let's go back to 1943, to the smell of ozone and the green fog. October 28, 1943. The first thing you noticed wasn't the ship, it was the air. The Philadelphia harbor usually smelled of diesel fuel, rotting fish, and the salt of the Atlantic. But on that day, the air tasted like pennies. It was a metallic, bitter taste that coated the back of your throat and made your fillings ache. It was the smell of ozone, but multiplied by 1,000. It was the smell of a thunderstorm that was trapped inside a bottle, waiting to break the glass. I was a deckhand on the SS Andrew Forsyth. We were docked adjacent to the target vessel, the USS Eldridge. To the untrained eye, she looked like a standard cannon-class destroyer escort. Gray paint, gun turrets, radar mast. But if you looked closer, if you looked at her the way a predator looks at prey, you could see the modifications. Massive copper cables were wrapped around the hull of the ship. They ran lengthwise from bow to stern, coiling back on themselves like snakes. They weren't just standard degaussing cables used to repel magnetic mines. These were thick, pulsating veins of conductive metal hooked up to generators that were far too large for a ship of that size. I stood on the fantail of my ship, leaning against the railing. The water in the harbor was choppy, gray, and cold. But around the Eldridge, the water looked different. It looked oily. It wasn't moving with the tide, it was vibrating, a low-frequency tremor that created tiny concentric rings rippling out from the hull. I remember seeing the men on the dock. Men in suits, not uniforms. Scientists. I saw a man who looked like Einstein, or at least someone who carried the weight of the world on his shoulders like him. They were checking clipboards. They were arguing, pointing at the sky, then pointing at the generators. There was a sense of urgency in their movements, a panic that they were trying to hide behind professional detachment. The crew of the Eldridge, they were just kids. Most of them were fresh out of boot camp. They were standing on the deck, smoking cigarettes, joking with each other. They had no idea. They thought this was just another drill. They thought they were testing a new radar jammer. They didn't know they were standing inside the chamber of a loaded gun. At 1600 hours, the order came down. Initiate the field. That's when the sound started. It wasn't a mechanical sound. It wasn't the roar of an engine. It was a whine, a high-pitched, piercing whine that you didn't hear with your ears. You felt it in your bones. It started deep in your stomach and worked its way up to your skull. The seagulls that had been circling the harbor suddenly stopped screaming. They dropped out of the sky, dead, just like that. Dozens of birds falling into the water like stones. Their nervous systems had been overloaded before the experiment even reached full power. I grabbed the railing, my knuckles turned white. The metal of my own ship felt hot to the touch. The static electricity in the air was building up so fast that the hair on my arm stood straight up. Sparks began to dance along the anchor chains. Blue, arcing tendrils of energy that snapped and hissed. The Eldridge began to blur. It wasn't disappearing. Not yet. It was shimmering, like looking at a highway on a scorching hot summer day. The heat haze distortion. The lines of the ship became wavy. The mast bent at an impossible angle and then snapped back. The hull seemed to expand and contract like the ship was breathing, like it was inhaling the space around it. I brought my binoculars up to my eyes. My hands were shaking. Through the lenses, I saw a sailor on the Eldridge. He was looking at his feet. He was stomping his boot on the deck over and over again. At first, I thought he was trying to put out a fire. But then I zoomed in. He wasn't stomping out a fire. He was trying to pull his boot free. The steel deck had become soft, like mud, and he was sinking into it. The generators ramped up to full power. The whine became a scream. And then, the green fog arrived. It didn't roll in from the sea. It exploded out of the molecules of the air itself. A radioactive, glowing, sick green mist that swallowed the ship whole, and the world held its breath. I want you to imagine a color you have never seen before. We have words for green. We think of grass or emeralds or the leaves of a tree. But the mist that began to bleed out of the air around the USS Eldridge was none of those. It was a chemical green, a dead green. It was the color of radiation burns on an old film reel. It glowed with its own internal luminescence, casting a sick, pale light onto the dark water of the harbor. The generators were screaming now. That high-pitched whine had become a physical force. I saw men on the dock covering their ears, falling to their knees. The fillings in my teeth were vibrating so hard I thought they would shatter. The metal railing of my ship was now too hot to touch. The induction field was expanding, reaching out, tasting the world around it. Then the fog moved. It didn't behave like weather. There was no wind to push it. It crawled. It slithered over the surface of the water like a blanket made of smoke. It rose up the sides of the destroyer, clinging to the steel plates, wrapping around the gun turrets, choking the mast. I focused my binoculars on the bridge of the Eldridge. I needed to see the captain. I needed to see someone in charge. What I saw stopped my heart. The fog wasn't just covering the ship, it was passing through it. I saw a sailor standing near the bow. He was holding onto a lifeline. As the green mist washed over him, he didn't cough, he didn't choke, he just faded. I could see the outline of his body, but inside the outline, I could see the steel bulkhead behind him. He was becoming transparent. He was becoming a ghost while he was still alive. I watched him lift his hand to his face. I saw the terror in his eyes. He was screaming, his mouth wide open, but no sound was coming out. The sound waves were being swallowed by the field. He looked at his own arm, and I saw him realize that his flesh was turning into glass. He tried to run, but his feet passed right through the deck. He stumbled, falling into the floor, his knees sinking into the solid steel as if it were quicksand. The ship began to pulse. It was phasing in and out of reality. 1 second, it was solid, 1,000 tons of warship. The next second, it was a sketch, a wireframe drawing made of green light. I heard a sound then, a sound that wasn't the generators. It sounded like fabric tearing, like a massive canvas sail being ripped in half by a storm. Rip. It was the sound of the universe breaking. The air pressure dropped instantly. My ears popped painfully. The water around the hull began to boil, not from heat but from the sudden vacuum. The fog swirled faster, creating a vortex, a cyclone of green energy that spun around the ship faster and faster until the Eldridge was just a blur, a smudge on the lens of reality. And then the light intensified. A flash of blue-white electricity arced from the top of the mast to the water. It was blinding. I threw my arm up to cover my eyes. When I looked back, the fog was settling, the water was calming, and the USS Eldridge was gone. Silence. That is the only word for it. Absolute, heavy, suffocating silence. The generators had stopped whining, the seagulls were dead, the men on the dock were frozen, staring at the empty space where a destroyer had been anchored 10 seconds ago. But it wasn't just empty. If a ship leaves a harbor, there is water left behind. There are waves. There is a wake. But looking at the spot where the Eldridge had been was like looking at a wound in the world that refused to bleed. There was a depression in the water, a massive hull-shaped indentation in the Atlantic Ocean. The water stood up on all sides, held back by an invisible wall. It was as if the ship was still there, pushing the water aside, but we just couldn't see it. The Navy report, the one they released years later to debunk my letters, claimed the ship had been teleported to Norfolk, Virginia. They said it appeared there for a few minutes and then came back. They called it a teleportation success. They are lying. The ship didn't go to Norfolk. I know this because I was looking at the void, and the void was looking back. I kept my binoculars trained on that empty hole in the water. The air above it was shimmering, like a mirage, and inside that shimmer, I saw shapes. Not solid shapes, shadows, movements. It looked like the green fog was still there, trapped in a layer of reality just beneath ours. I saw twisting forms. I saw things that looked like tentacles, or maybe vast geometric structures that didn't make sense to the human eye. They were moving in the space where the crew should have been. I felt a wave of nausea hit me, a deep, primal sickness. It wasn't seasickness, it was the feeling of being near something that violates the laws of nature. My brain couldn't process the emptiness. I started to get a headache, a sharp pain right behind my eyes. I wasn't the only one. On the dock, I saw the scientist retreating. The man who looked like Einstein was rubbing his temples, looking pale. He knew. He knew that they hadn't just moved a ship from point A to point B. They had pushed a ship outside of the timeline. They had dunked it into the abyss, like dipping a teabag into water. And now they were just waiting to see what flavor the water would turn. For 15 minutes, we stared at nothing. 15 minutes of dead silence. 15 minutes of the water refusing to fill the hole. And then, the smell returned. That copper taste, that ozone stench. It came back 10 times stronger than before. The air turned yellow. The invisible wall holding back the water began to crackle with static electricity. The universe was rejecting the intruder. It was spitting the Eldridge back out. But as the air began to thicken, and the outline of the ship started to materialize again in the mist, I realized something terrifying. The ship that left was gray steel. The ship that was coming back was glowing red. It was coming back hot. It was coming back wrong. When the Eldridge returned, the silence didn't last. It was broken by a sound that I hope you never have to hear. It was the sound of 300 men screaming at once. The ship materialized instantly. One moment there was a hole in the water, and the next, the displacement of air created a thunderclap that shook the fillings in my teeth. The green fog dissipated quickly, retreating into the cracks of the deck, sinking back into the steel. I grabbed my kit bag, I ran down the gangplank of the Furoseth and sprinted toward the destroyer. I wasn't the only one. Medics, MPs, and those scientists in their clean suits were all rushing toward the ship, but they stopped at the edge of the gangway. They stopped, and they recoiled. Some of them turned away and vomited. I pushed past them. I climbed onto the main deck of the USS Eldridge. The heat was unbearable. The metal of the ship was radiating a fever, like living skin, but it was what I saw on the bulkhead that froze my blood. There were 2 sailors standing near the gun turret, or at least they looked like they were standing. But their posture was wrong. They were rigid, unnatural. I walked closer. I reached out to grab the shoulder of the first man. "Soldier," I said. "Report." He didn't answer. He didn't blink. I looked down at his legs. They weren't there. His uniform ended at the thighs. Below that, there was no blood. There was no severance. His body simply flowed into the solid steel deck. The molecules of his flesh had merged perfectly with the molecules of the ship. He was fused, welded by a force that ignored biology. He was alive. I could see the pulse in his neck. I could see his chest rising and falling. But he was no longer just a man. He was the ship. His nervous system was wired into the hydraulic lines. He was feeling the engine vibrations as if they were his own heartbeat. I heard a wail from the bridge. I ran up the ladder. Inside the wheelhouse, the helmsman was screaming. His hands were on the wheel, but he couldn't let go. His fingers had sunk into the metal steering column. The skin of his wrists had stretched and blended with the brass. He was begging us to cut his hands off. He was begging for an amputation. But the worst was the man in the mess hall. We found him buried up to his neck in the wall. Just his head was sticking out of the steel bulkhead. His eyes were wide, darting around the room in panic. He was breathing, he was crying, but his lungs, his stomach, His heart? They were all sharing space with the iron atoms of the wall. How long can a man survive when his blood is pumping through a steel plate? Longer than you think. The scientists didn't help them. They just watched. They took notes. They looked at these abominations with fascination, not pity. They called it molecular interbonding. I called it hell. Those who merged with the ship were the unlucky ones. They died quickly, or they were euthanized by the medical teams to stop the screaming. But there was another group, the survivors, the ones who looked fine, the ones who walked off the ship on their own two legs. We thought they were safe. We were wrong. We called it the freeze. It started in the infirmary. I was sitting next to a kid named Kowalski. He was 19. He was shaking, smoking a cigarette, telling me about the green fog. He said the fog was alive. He said it whispered to him. Then mid-sentence, he stopped. He didn't just stop talking. He stopped existing in our time. His mouth was open. The smoke from his cigarette hung in the air, perfectly still, like a photograph. His eyes didn't blink. I waved my hand in front of his face. Nothing. I touched his arm. It was cold, not dead cold. Absolute zero cold. It felt like touching a statue made of dry ice. I yelled for a medic. The doctor came over, took one look, and whispered, "Lay hands on him. Now." Two other sailors rushed over. They grabbed Kowalski's shoulders. They shook him. They rubbed his arms. And suddenly, snap. Kowalski gasped, sucking in air like a drowning man breaking the surface. The smoke from his cigarette started moving again. He looked around, terrified. "Why are you looking at me, Mom?" he asked. "I was just talking." To him, no time had passed. To us, he had been gone for 10 minutes. The doctor explained it later, in hushed tones. He said the men were unstuck. The experiment had loosened their grip on the present moment. If they stood still for too long, they would slip out of the time stream. They would get stuck in the seconds between the seconds. And if we didn't touch them, if we didn't use the bioelectric energy of another human being to anchor them back to this reality, they would fade. I saw it happen. A week later, in a bar near the Navy Yard, a fight broke out. Two of the Eldridge survivors were there. One of them got punched. He stumbled back against the wall, and then he froze. The bar went silent. We all knew the drill. "Get him!" someone shouted. "Ground him!" But we were too slow. Before anyone could touch him, he began to turn transparent. First his uniform, then his skin, then his bones. He looked at us with eyes that were fading into mist. He opened his mouth to scream, but only silence came out. And then he was gone. No body, no ash. Just an empty space where a man used to be. The Navy says he deserted. They marked him as AWOL. But I know where he is. He's still in that bar. He's still standing against that wall. He's just trapped in a moment that passed 50 years ago. Screaming for help that will never arrive. They told us to forget. They told us it never happened. But how do you forget a man who disappears right in front of your eyes? How do you forget the smell of burning ozone? You don't. You just wait for the fog to come for you too. You might be asking yourself, if all of this happened, why isn't it on the news? Why isn't it in the history books? Because the United States Navy knows how to clean up a mess. They towed the USS Eldridge into a dry dock before the sun came up. They draped huge canvas tarps over the hull so no one could see the distortions in the metal. As for us, the witnesses, they rounded us up. They took the crew of the Furuseth and the survivors of the Eldridge to a secure facility. I was kept in a room with no windows for 3 weeks. Men in gray suits came in every day. They didn't ask questions. They gave statements. They told me what I saw. "You saw a magnetic mine defense test," they said. "You saw a discharge of static electricity," they said. "The screaming was due to panic, not pain," they both said. They made us sign papers. Thick stacks of legal documents that said if we ever spoke a word of this, we would be tried for treason. We would be buried in a prison so deep that sunlight would be a memory. Most of the men signed. They wanted to go home. They wanted to forget the smell of ozone. But I couldn't sign because I knew that ink on paper couldn't stop what was coming. Morris Jessup, the man I sent my letters to, he tried to investigate. He tried to use science to prove what I saw, and they found him in his car in Florida. A hose connected from the exhaust pipe to the window. Ruled a suicide, but I know the truth. Jessup didn't kill himself. He was erased, just like the sailors on that deck. I have spent my life running, moving from motel to motel, changing my name, looking over my shoulder. Sometimes Late at night, I can still feel the vibration in the floorboards. I can still taste the copper in my mouth. The Eldridge was decommissioned. They say they sold it for scrap to Greece. They say it was melted down into razor blades and cars. But metal has a memory. If you are driving a car made of recycled steel and the radio suddenly starts playing static, or the doors lock by themselves, don't be surprised. You might be driving a piece of the ship, and it might be trying to take you back to 1943. My name is Carlos Allende. I am tired of running. I am tired of the Fatma. I am leaving this tape here. If you find it, don't look for me. I am already gone. Carlos Allende died in 1994. The official cause was heart failure. He died in a small room claiming that the walls were breathing. To this day, the Philadelphia experiment remains the most controversial military legend in American history. The Navy denies it. Physicists say it is impossible. Skeptics say it was the ramblings of a madman. But here's the thing about legends. They don't need permission to be true. We know that Einstein was working on unified field theory. We know the Navy was desperate to hide their ships from Nazi U-boats. And we know that during war, ethics are often the first casualty. Maybe they didn't mean to open a door to another dimension. Maybe they just wanted to bend light. But when you pull on the fabric of reality, you never know what is going to unravel. There is a theory in quantum physics that says time is not a straight line. It is a loop. If the USS Eldridge really did punch a hole in space-time, that hole might still be open. Drifting, invisible, moving through our world like a storm front. So tonight, before you go to sleep, I want you to do one thing. Look in the mirror. Look at your reflection. Does it blink at the exact same time you do? Or is there a delay, a tiny microsecond lag? If you see a delay, don't panic, don't scream, just step away from the mirror. Because if your reflection isn't moving with you, it means you are already stuck, and the fog is coming. I am Captain Nightwhisper. Stay solid, stay in the light, and never, ever trust the silence. Good night.